Hi guys, this is Ant from Your Property Network, I was chatting to a good friend of mine who's on the call right now, Dillon Dinesha, about social housing, and I thought actually what we could do is just hit record and send this out because it's a topic that a lot of people are interested in. We do a lot of articles on it, on whether or not you can do well financially whilst also doing good in the community. It's something that many people are really passionate about. Can I make a difference as a property investor? And Dillon is, I don't even know how to begin to sum up who Dillon is and what he does, because he has a really varied background, but we're talking specifically about social housing today. So Dillon, you are a very spiritual person. Actually, kind of being a force for good is really important to you and everything that you do. So for people who aren't familiar with you, can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So that force for good bit is really interesting and exciting to me, because the more inner work I've done, the more I've realized that's, I think, because I've never really felt good enough, and I've always had to kind of prove myself everywhere that I've been. But that actually is manifested in a beautiful way, which is kind of taking, growing up in social housing. My parents were refugees, so we always had this kind of real weird money mindset. Money was the solution to all problems, but it was also the big evil. And then with this kind of other aspect of never being good enough, being brought up in a big family and kind of always being compared to everybody else, I've had to bring the two things together and reconcile them and say to myself, well, actually, look, let's fix the money mindset. And I did all sorts of crazy stuff around that, to understand that money can be a force for good, and to understand that, when capitalism is played in the right way, that game is played in the right way, it doesn't have to be a game of, I win, you lose. It doesn't have to be a game of coercion and competition and, conflict, which is essentially how it's manifested in the wider world. So there was a real wholesome look at money. And then by the same token, well, if money can be a force for good and I can switch my mindset around that, well, maybe I can start feeling good enough by making enough money and playing the capitalism game in the way that I want to play it, in the way that feels good, and doing good with it. So actually, a lot of the work that I do is not wholly altruistic. I think there's a lot of selfishness in the work because it makes me feel better, helps me feel, good enough. It allows me to sleep easy at night. And I think ultimately allows me to prove to my parents that, I wasn't the runt of the litter, essentially. So that's, I guess that's a broad context of why social housing, because it allows me to do both things. It allows me to really sleep easy at night, really feel like I'm doing meaningful work, and also allows me to play the game of capitalism actually in the way that I feel it's always been designed to be played.
And we don't, as landlords, we rarely get painted with a positive brush, do we? We're quite often painted as the bad guys, and we're capitalizing and we're making money, and someone else is losing as a result of that. Now, I've never really felt that. I've felt that with some of my properties, I house the people who are kind of the most vulnerable, and probably a lot of other landlords, a lot of other people wouldn't give the keys to a big asset to someone else who maybe has no track record, and and a lot of people wouldn't trust them. So I feel that sometimes I'm doing a good thing by what I'm doing, and financially doing well from it myself at the same time, because pure altruism, doing something, we might think, in terms of a charity, and you and I and everybody else out there would really quickly run out of money if we were just giving stuff away. Yeah,
right, absolutely. And this is why I love talking to you, because you've got this real sense of bringing the two aspects together, understanding that in order to make money and do it in a way that feels good and nurtures the soul and allows you to sleep easy at night, in order to do that, you have to do it through a vehicle that makes a difference. But then, of course, to make a difference sustainably, you've got to kind of do that through a conduit that makes money. And the two are both sides of the same coin. And I've found through experience, as I'm sure you have, that you can't do one without the other. You can't make money and only make money and do that at the expense of somebody else's well-being, as an example, which a lot of businesses, do, because that's how they feel capitalism is designed. And that doesn't feel good. And the money, from a spiritual perspective, if that's the way you want to look at it, I was always told, for every one bad pound you bring in, this is my mum, for every one bad pound you bring in, dad will lose 10. So it wasn't even you'd lose 10. The guilt factor was really ramped up.
The guilt was there, yeah.
Yeah, it really was. And she gave me great counsel, and I jest about it, but she was absolutely fundamental to teaching me about the broader value of money, and that it's not just this thing that you can buy nice stuff with, but actually it's a thing that you can do nice stuff with. And I think without her counsel in that respect, and then my dad's counsel as an accountant, I don't think the two could have worked. So yeah, make money, make a difference. They are both two sides of the same coin, I feel, and as I know that you do.
And you use a phrase which called the triple bottom line, and it's actually something that we hear more and more from ethical businesses and businesses that are there as a commercial entity to make money, but also go above and beyond that and perhaps add something else to society. You and I both surf, and we've both admitted that we surf badly. And I read this phrase, the triple bottom line, actually, about a place here in Bristol called The Wave, and inland surfing. Yeah. Some people will know about it. And they use that phrase because they bring kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, all sorts of backgrounds, and give them the opportunity to learn how to do this amazing thing. Yeah. For you and I, that's falling off a surfboard. But so this kind of phrase, the triple bottom line, is becoming more common parlance. And can you perhaps explain what that means for you, and how that fits in with your social housing, I guess, sort of enterprise, your business?
Sure, man. One of the things I'm really pleased about is exactly that, how more and more businesses are using that phrase, but as a result of having built their businesses around that phrase. And I love the stuff that the guys do at The Wave. It is incredible how they bring disadvantaged children and give them experiences actually they would never have, and that has such a lasting effect. And where I came across this term for the first time ever was like 2007-8, and I was doing some work in Rwanda. And the work I was doing out there was for the essentially the president's view of the Millennium Development Goals. It was all around youth entrepreneurship. And these young people were absolutely plugged into this idea of building businesses in Rwanda that hit the triple bottom line. And before that, I didn't really know what that meant. I'd done some projects here at the Home Office. I'd been a financial trader. Never really knew about the triple bottom line, and that's what set me off on this journey. And so that was a good kind of 10-15 years ago. And I was speaking to about 100 or so property investors last night, and I kind of just thought to myself on the way down there, this work for me in social housing is like a perfect bringing together of all of my spiritual intentions to make a difference, and all of my capitalist intentions to make money. And the triple bottom line essentially in social housing is three things. Number one, it's income, and we'll break that down in a second. Number two is impact. And then number three, and this is specific to social housing, it's specific to my kind of background in starting and exiting businesses, and that is investability. So from an income perspective, we hear a lot in property investing about really squeezing the asset, metaphorically and practically, squeezing that asset for as much profit as you can get. And that generally involves, number one, pulling all of your money out of the deal so that you've got an infinite return. Number two, it might involve some hacks of the system. So you're taking a single building and turning it into a HMO, or you're taking a family home and turning it to serviced accommodation, or you're taking a guest house that doesn't work and turning that to serviced accommodation, or you're taking an office building and turning that to residential. So essentially the context of property investing and the context of land and forestry and real estate is really important to understand before we even consider entering the property investment space. And I know that you and I have spoken about this before, but it's not something that's really ever spoken about, because what's spoken about is the strategies. And the strategies are they're the effect end of the cause effect chain. And what I mean by that is, if you look back historically, land, real estate, forestry, it was never owned by us. It was never owned by the rising middle class. It was never owned by people who grew up in council estates and to the system. In essence, there were the lords and there were the serfs. and the lords owned the land, and the serfs farmed the land and tilled the land, and you know, they essentially, they knew their place in society. The lords looked after the serfs, kept them just happy enough so that they wouldn't revolt, and the serfs knew that without the lords they wouldn't even be enjoying the quality of life that they enjoy now. So it was a system that kind of worked. It wasn't great, but in the sense that it worked for what it was, it did the job. Now, all of that changed when Joan of Arc started, you know, burning shit down in France. And I use that term metaphorically, but essentially that was the beginning, you know, of the revolution. And then you got this thing called the rising middle class. And what the rising middle class did is started to play the game of capitalism. There's a book by Thomas Piketty called Capital. It's like this thick, you know, it's like all editions of the Bible and the Gita and all religious texts all in one. But it's a fantastic book called Capital. And essentially what happened is that the middle classes started to play the system in order to become more like the lords. And if you think about what we do in property investing, isn't that what we're doing? We're playing the system to take ownership of assets and land and forestry and all that kind of cool stuff. But the way we play it is by hacking the system. So there's this crazy stat, which is something like 80% of all rented property is unencumbered. And I don't know how accurate that is, and it might just be a Pareto's 80-20 statistic, but I've heard it a few times now, and I've seen it printed in, you know, pretty reputable financial press. 80% of all rental property is unencumbered, which means that 80% of that property, of course, has no mortgages, and it's owned by people that are storing their cash in real estate. The 20% left is essentially residential homeowners, but they're not included in the rental space. So accidental landlords, you know, somebody that didn't sell their residential home and is now a landlord, or people like you and I who are professional property investors, and we do it through debt. And so what you've constantly got is this continued pressure on the middle class property investor through policy, through regulation, through taxation, through things like, you know, practical things, Section 24, Section 21, Article 4, selective licensing, the really punitive measures around council tax that we're seeing now in Wales that have been tried to be implemented in Britain, and they haven't been, you know, a lot of those have been overturned. But you've got this continued pressure on property investors, hacking the system through service accommodation and HMOs and boutique HMOs and commercial conversions and, you know, all the other strategies, that is attempting to squeeze them out of the market and attempting to kind of sweep up ownership back to the top. So the historical context is lords and serfs and a rising middle class, but actually the modern context is institutional investors are now the new lords. If you look at the biggest landowners in the US, you know, it's Bill Gates, it's Jeff Bezos, it's the big companies, Mark Zuckerberg, you know, essentially all the CEOs of big companies. If you look at who the biggest landlords in the UK are, at the moment, they're social housing providers, so they're housing associations. People like Notting Hill Genesis have 60,000 properties, and they're not even one of the biggest. They're fairly big, but there are bigger housing associations than them. And it's essentially now becoming more private organizations. So we just saw the story, I think it was this week, Lloyd's Bank just did a deal with the developer to, I think, buy up whatever it was, however many hundreds of houses. The Barclay Group just announced over £100 million worth of investment in residential real estate. The CEO of John Lewis, when she came in, she announced that we're getting into residential real estate. And so you've got this consolidation in the marketplace again, that is essentially the lords, the modern day lords, who is of course the corporation, and the serfs, which is essentially the middle classes that are now being squeezed out of the middle class and are dropping down. You know, this upward mobility that we've seen over the last 10 years in a very low interest rate environment is now turning very quickly into downward mobility. And you only have to look at statistics around food banks to see how many in employment people are now going to the food bank. So the historical context is that we're hacking the system in order to be a little bit more like the lords. Well, what we have as an opportunity in social housing is actually to be a bit more like the lords. We still hack the financial system. So I'm not suggesting we go out and get tons of unencumbered properties, or we save up, you know, the 200 grand to buy one. So we still hack the financial system. I'm going to talk about investability in a second. But what we're able to do now for the first time in residential real estate is build something with a view to exiting to the modern day lords, to the housing associations to the institutional investors who are looking to enter the social housing space if they're institutional, or who are looking to expand their portfolios by purchasing and leasing because they can't afford to build. There was a report done by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation in 2018, which talked about what they call the socialization of private rental stock. And essentially what that means is that housing associations going and buying up private rental stock in order to socialize the private rental stock. But of course, they can't afford to do that. Neither can they afford to build. So what they're doing is leasing properties long-term through things like the Housing Association leasing scheme. So the historical context and how that's manifest in the modern context, this kind of polarization between the people that own the assets and the people that don't, and two classes of asset owners, they don't and they do, rather than three classes of asset owner, is really important to understand. And it's all about following where the big money is. You know, where's the big money at the moment? Who are the big landlords? Where's the big investment? You know, where are the big government grants in housing? Things like the Affordable Homes Programme. It's all in social housing right now. And by the same token, on the flip side, where are the punitive measures coming in place? Well, they're coming in place in the private rental sector, which is squeezing that middle class property investor out of the game, as was always intended.
Okay, so where is the opportunity for us as you know, people who want to be altruistic property investors with very much a sort of capitalist hat on at the same time? We want to, as you say, we want to move to be a little bit closer to the Lords. We want to kind of move up the ladder. You know, that's, I guess, why we exist, really, isn't it? That's what we do. So where is the opportunity for us as someone who's kind of sitting in the middle? Maybe we definitely don't want to be part of the kind of squeezed, you know, middle class that you're talking about, which, you know, let's be honest, we're all seeing private landlords exiting the market because they're just finding it too painful, too hard work, you know, can't navigate it anymore, more challenging to make money. And the result of that is, I'm sure you've seen it, I definitely have, we all have increasing rents, you know, lack of supply, complete lack of stock, actually. So we're in this weird position where actually it's really difficult for someone to rent a property right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you know what, you've just bridged me perfectly into the answer to your question, where's the opportunity? So the opportunity is starting with the end in mind. And that is what so many residential property investors have never done. And what I mean by that is a lot of residential property investors, their big exit was, you know, wait for my property price to double and then, you know, sell one, keep two, pay off the debt. And now I've got an unencumbered portfolio that I can hand down and so on and so forth. But that attracts huge amounts of inheritance tax. And it's not really owning land and real estate in the way that, you know, private sector landlords own land and real estate is not really that tax efficient. So the big opportunity lies in starting with the end in mind, seeing what's happening in the marketplace. So what made me an award-winning trader was following the big money and looking at the macro trends. There was a report done, it was either by the House of Commons Committee or the All-Party Parliamentary Group. I can't remember whether it was the HOC or the APPG, one of the two. But it talked about essentially how there's a consolidation in the space and how essentially you are going to have social housing providers needing to buy up stock. And it was linked to the Joseph Rowntree socialization report. So that the trends are that over the next 6, 8, 10 years, it won't happen sooner than that because they just don't have the structures in place yet. They're leasing at the moment. But once they've finished leasing, and once they realize now that actually they've got enough stock on lease that they can go out to then offer to buy in the same way that we would do a lease option, that's what's happening in the social housing space by housing associations, even at the moment by local authorities. So local authorities are always slightly ahead of the game. They're already being given government grants to go and buy up stock. Barnet Council bought 50 houses for cash here in Peterborough to, there's a little wasp just wanting to have a little sniff about. But yeah, Barnet Council just bought 50 houses for cash in Peterborough. They are essentially, you know, moving families out. We got offered for a property worth £183,000. We got offered 220 for that. It had been on the private sector leasing scheme to Peterborough City Council for 5 years, plus 2 years of the next round. And they had all this money in, and they offered us £220,000 for that property. I didn't exit because I've got a different exit plan. You know, I'm building a bigger portfolio to exit the whole lot in one go. But starting with the end in mind, look at the macro trend, look at consolidation in the marketplace, look at who is going to be buying this stock in the next 6 to 8 years, and build your portfolio as a business. So when we're building a tech company, for example, you know, what are we really looking at? We're looking at creating a product that people want, creating a product that has got an increasing in demand, creating a product where we've got a ready supply of the raw materials, and ultimately creating a business with an almost predictable cash flow, an almost predictable cost base, and a view on who's going to buy that business for a multiple at the end. You know, these are the factors that go into setting up a tech business, or any business, in fact. And I've applied those to the social housing sector, and in fact property investment. You can't do that in service accommodation, you can't do that with HMOs, you can't do that with even single family homes. It's really difficult to build what I would call a widget based business. With the social housing investor based business, what you're doing is building a portfolio that has some level of uniformity in the kinds of people it leases to. For us, that's local authorities and housing associations. Only 20% of our business is supported in assisted living, and I can talk about why further down the line. But we're building a business with some uniformity. We're building a business with essentially a type of user, a type of buyer, housing association or local authority. We're also building a business, really importantly, that has a fixed cost and a fixed income model. So the challenge with real estate investing has always been squeezing the asset for that extra bit of income and trying as much as you can to offset the increasing cost of running that business, whether that's increasing interest rates or whatever it might be. So what we're saying is that, and what we're experiencing is that, number one, you can create leases with local authorities and housing associations for anywhere between 5, 10, 15, even 25 years that are generally based on the local housing allowance plus a surplus, depending on which part of the market you're addressing. So you've got this fixed income element that is linked to increases in housing allowance, sometimes linked to RPI as well, although not always. And then you've got a fixed cost model, because now I know that I've got a 5, 6, 7, 10, 15, 25 year cash flow. I can organize my lending around those parameters. Yes, conventional commercial lending is going to give me at the moment a maximum of 5 years, and some of them don't even want to give you that. But essentially, you know, you're going to go on commercial lending. But there is a huge amount of money out there. But like I said, I come from this impact investment background, the stuff that we did in Rwanda. So I don't go to investors who are being pitched property deals, and I don't teach my people to go to investors who are being pitched property deals. I go to angel investors and impact investors that maybe haven't even thought about real estate as a place that they can deploy their money for the social win and the capitalist win. But we explain to them, we show them what we're doing. And when you speak to these investors, essentially they are very, very aware of all the factors I spoke to you about in terms of building a business to exit. So then when we share with them the plan, all of a sudden we're not having to offer them 12% return, 1% a month for 12 months, and make it sound essentially to an experienced investor like we're selling some kind of Ponzi scheme. So you're going to give me 12% return in 12 months, and you're buying and investing in a property. A lot of investors don't get that. You know, I get a lot of people saying to me, Dillon, I'm offering them a really good deal, and for some reason they're just not getting excited by it. That's because an experienced investor, they want a couple of things. Number one, yes, they want good returns, but they're not attracted by astronomical returns, because immediately they're seeing in front of them, you know, a Bernie Madoff, some kind of crazy Ponzi scheme. But number two, they're not interested in getting their money back in 12 months time. You know, what they're interested in is decent returns for as long as they possibly can, where risk is mitigated. And there's nowhere better to offer those terms than in social housing, where you've got this guaranteed period of rent. that is underwritten by a strong covenant. This is why we work with local authorities and housing associations and not many social supported and assisted living providers. So I know it's not for everyone. A lot of people love supported and assisted living. We work where the covenant is strong. We work with the people who are closest to that government pot of money. So you've got this really strong lease, plus you've got an exit plan, plus you've got an asset backing. And so when you're talking to an educated investor, that is exactly what they want. And so our average cost of borrowing, even in these times where, you know, interest rates are, you know, as high as they've been in my entire property journey, well, our average cost of borrowing is still only between kind of 6 and 7.5% to 8% at the very, very, very top end. Most of our loans are being, private investor loans are being brought in at 6, 6.5%, 6.75%, which is only marginally above what they'd get in the wider space. But that's all they want. They want something that slightly beats the market for as long as they possibly can. So the real opportunity here is, number one, to play the game in the way that essentially the real estate game has always been designed, which is there are only two classes of people in this game. There are the ones that have the assets and build big portfolios, and then there's the ones that essentially don't have the assets. So we're playing the game in that way. Number two, it's about understanding we're playing the game to exit. So building a portfolio with a fixed income, a fixed cost model. By the way, the costs are the cost of borrowing and your insurance costs, because a lot of the leases, well, all the leases that we have and all the leases that anyone would have and should have are the equivalent of FRI leases in the commercial space, so fully repairing and insuring leases. Now, there are a lot of scare stories around, and, you know, we've got to address the elephant in the room. There are stories of companies like Serco handing back properties in an awful state. We don't work with Serco or Mears or Clear Springs. Mears are actually the better of the three, I have to say, but we don't work with those organizations because they are, again, you know, private organizations that have won government contracts and that are in the business of, you know, being a private business. What we're working with and who we're working with is people who have got strong covenants, local authorities, housing associations that are close to that government pot of money. So fixed income, fixed cost models that essentially allow us to predict cash flow over a long period of time and allow us to package up this business of widgets to exit. And we're looking at two exit routes. You can't ever absolutely know who's going to buy your business, in the same way that we never knew who's going to buy the tech businesses that we exited. But you can have an idea of the kinds of businesses that you would be making yourself attractive to, you know, peacocking yourself to. And the beautiful thing about this is that the same housing associations that are leasing properties from us, the same housing associations that we're doing the commercial to social conversions with, are going to be the ones that will eventually buy our portfolios. And if they don't buy, then we'll look at pension companies. And if they don't buy, we'll look at private equity. That's kind of my third choice. And if they don't buy, there will be plenty of the institutional investors like the Barclay Group, like John Lewis, like Lloyd's, who at that point will have saturated the residential market, which is where they're going for first, the private residential market, and then we'll be looking to dominate the social housing space. And you've only got to look at Tesco's journey in the supermarket space to see exactly what they did. They built out-of-town supermarkets, and then they took over corner shops. And essentially, that's the same type of consolidation we see in every single marketplace, and it's no different to what's happening now in residential real estate.
Okay, so what's your timeline for exit? You know, how long do you envisage you being in, you know, social housing before you're at a point where you say, you know what, now here's my exit? How long do you envisage being in the market?
Great question, and this is something that I've got a plan for, but the plan will very much be guided by the economic circumstances at the time of exit. So what I do know for certain is that in the next 36 months, we have a huge acquisition opportunity. So demand is increasing. This is a hot political topic, so there's lots of government money available. And sadly, very sadly, you know, all the trauma that we've seen across the country over the last few weeks has only exacerbated the or highlighted the challenge around social housing, which has placed, you know, strong government attention on it. And the attention has come for the wrong reasons. And you know, we don't want to capitalize on misfortune, but you do have to look at the trend. So number one, it's an area right now where there is huge demand and huge government attention and lots of money being thrown at that area in terms of grants and the affordable housing program and so on. Number two, huge supply of stock. So whilst there's limited supply of rental stock at the moment because lots of landlords are looking to exit the market, actually there is a growing supply in the stock of portfolios to buy up, in the stock of ex-rental properties to buy up. For example, 3 beds that don't work on the private rental sector market because the rents just aren't enough work very well in social housing because you reconfigure them to get 4 or 5 times the 1-bed rate. And so all of a sudden, a 3-bed that doesn't work in the private rental sector now works in the social housing space. And so you've got this huge supply of stock. So again, when you're building a business, is there demand and is there an adequate, abundant supply of raw material? And for us, there is. So what I do know is that economically, there's a 36-month window of opportunity here to really go on an acquisition spree. It's actually the same kind of opportunity that was around post-financial crash. And if you remember post-financial crash, the opportunity didn't really come to us until about 2009, even 10, if you remember, because straight after the crash, we went into the Eurozone crisis. And so really, we had this period, 2009, 2010 to 2013, before property prices started stabilizing and then increasing. And then really from 13 to 2023, that 10-year period, yes, it's been great because interest rates have been low. But actually, prices have been increasing and investors have been getting into a market that, has got to its top end. So the big window of opportunity, particularly for us, where we did lots of lease options, and I grew up with lease options, was for us, it stopped at 2013. After that, 2013, 2014, lease options became harder. And that turned into lease options light, which I call rent to rent, because there was no option to buy. So 36 months acquisition, which aligns with the goal to house 10,000 vulnerable families by 2027. And we're on a massive acquisition spree. By the way, we can't do this alone, which is why I'm so grateful to you for kind of just giving me the platform to share this. I'm really, I cannot tell you what that means to me. This is the most meaningful work I've ever done in my fucking life. And for you to give me the platform, I'm ridiculously grateful for. 36 months acquisition. And then we'll start to shape up the portfolio and make ourselves attractive to a buyer. And I'm expecting to find a buyer at about the 6-year point. 3 years to acquire, another couple to 3 years to make that portfolio attractive and find a buyer. And then we'll be looking to exit at anywhere around 6 to 8 years. And again, that will very much depend on, what's exactly happening in the space at the time, whether the macro trends that I'm seeing play out. Generally they do, but you never know. And essentially who the buyers are and what they're offering at the time and what the multiple is. So the key thing at time of exit is what is the multiple on this business, because we'll get paid for the covenants and the cash flow that's in place and also for the asset base. So there's 2 bits of income we're going to get for this business, in the same way that there's 2 bits of income in a tech business or in a widget business, which is, money for the cash flow and money for the IP. And that's essentially the model. So 3 years to acquire, really start acquiring heavy, use lease options, use investor finance, use investor finance as 30% deposits on bridge. Like, you use whatever you can to acquire, buy up portfolios, reconfigure them for social housing, get the 3, 5, 7, 10, 25-year leases, do as many of those as you can. And I can talk about scale another time. So what's the path to scale? And then look to shape up the portfolio, tidy it up, maybe get rid of the bottom 5% and the top 5%. So you've got that juicy bit in the middle, make it attractive, reconfigure it, get new leases in place with the people that are leasing from you so that you've got more strong covenants, you've got longer leases, etc., etc., etc. Maybe pay down some of the debt if that's what you need to do, and then make that business attractive to a buyer. And generally those buyers are going to be the people that are leasing from you already. So 3 years to acquire, 6 to 8 years for the exit.
Okay, and so just to clarify something there, do you envisage achieving kind of over market value when selling properties, because you're not just selling the asset and a tenant who can give a month's notice and be gone? You've got a commercial lease in there, so you're getting the multiplier on the income there because there's a really strong covenant on top of the kind of the bricks and mortar asset value of the property. So you envisage achieving over what you would if you were just selling to a homeowner or selling on the open market.
Yeah, absolutely right. And when structured in the right way, you're not subjected and won't be subjected to essentially the challenges that landlords are having right now of exiting 1 or 2 properties at a time, or handing over a spreadsheet of properties to an estate agent, and the estate agent sends that out to investors and everyone cherry picks the best properties. It's a real ball ache. You know, I spoke at an event in Oxford last week to maybe 70 or 80 investors, and there was one guy in there who I've known has been in the space for 10 years, lovely guy, Richard, and he's been exiting his portfolio, and you know, he shared how challenging that process is, because he never started out, and why would he start out with the intention to exit? So there will be a multiple. I don't know what that multiple is going to be, and again, that's really going to be where that 6 to 8 year sweet spot sits essentially. But in the same way that we're already being offered over market value for some of the properties that we've got leased to the local authority, leased to housing associations, that principle will be multiplied up across the portfolio. It's not necessarily that they'll offer us more money for the asset on its own, but exactly as you say, they'll offer more money because it comes with the asset plus the benefits that come with the longer term leases. And for a housing association that's buying a portfolio that they already lease, all of a sudden they do exactly what the Joseph Rowntree Foundation report is suggesting they do, and that is socializing private rental stock. So all the macro trends are heading in that way.
Okay, great. And so I know that anybody watching this is going to have a huge number of questions about, okay, well, what type of properties am I looking for? How do I approach a housing association or a local authority? How do I piece these two things together? How do I find the motivated landlords? You know, how do I actually build this business? And it's more appropriate that actually those questions are asked live, isn't it? That people can come on and direct their very individual questions to you. So we're going to give people the opportunity to do that, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. And I love sharing this stuff, and I love engaging with, you know, heart-driven real estate investors that want to do this work. So I love doing these sessions live. We run, it's called the Social Investor Masterclass, and it runs kind of periodically throughout the year. It can be found at socialinvestorclass.com, socialinvestorclass.com. And there'll be details there of when the next class is running. They're only ever live precisely for the reason that you mentioned, and precisely because I love engaging live with people. So it's a 2-hour class. It drills into the mechanics, exactly as you've suggested, of finding, funding, and filling properties. And it is a different process to finding, funding, and filling properties in the private rental sector. You know, there are some nuances that we have to be absolutely mindful of in order to make the business work. So, you know, it's a 3-step and then 9 sub-steps. We go really deep into the tactics. Socialinvestorclass.com, and I would love to see as many people there as possible, because even if one person decides that I'm getting into this space, you know, I know that's one person that's going to help us hit that goal of 10,000 vulnerable families housed. So yeah, please come along, ask all your questions there. It's live.
Okay, so wherever you're watching this video, if you've got an email from us or maybe watching it in the YPN app or on our YouTube channel or wherever it might be, we'll make sure that we've got the appropriate link in there for you to click to join us on the masterclass, get your questions answered about this, find out a little bit more about, well, it's those 3 fundamental F's, isn't it? Of find, fund, fill. Yeah. You know, they're the big questions that we all have. You know, whenever I do any interview with any investor, and I think I may have done in excess of 2,000 of these over the last sort of 16 years. That's what I want to know. Is how do you find that thing? Where do you get the money from? Because most of us aren't sat on, you know, 2, 3, 5, 10 million pounds worth of cash. You know, that's not who we are. You know, we have to be creative about this. So I'm really excited. I'm really excited about this masterclass. I'm definitely going to be on it. And I'm going to be making a list of all my questions at the same time.
Good.
So, okay, we're going to have the link there. We'd love for you to be able to join us. You know, we've kind of scratched the surface that, you know, today in the opportunities and, you know, where Dillon's going with his business, the altruistic property investing, you know, it's great for us to be seen in the positive light. I don't know about you, I've definitely been to some property shows before in the past where I've kind of been booed as I'm walking in by shelter and accosted by people who think I really am a kind of a demon of some sort. So it's really great to be able to actually show who we really are and what we do, and that we have a conscience as well, and that we're trying to be a force for good as well as climbing that ladder ourselves to be a little bit closer to the Lords that we were talking about earlier on.
Beautiful, man. Thank you so much, Anne. I cannot wait to run the class. I'm again so grateful for the platform. I couldn't do this without you, man. Thank you so much.
Okay, and thanks for jumping on today, and being okay with me just hitting record as we were mid conversation.
Of
so
course.
Everyone watching this, look forward to seeing you on the masterclass. There'll be all of your questions answered. Follow the link, and Dillon will be there to answer anything that you have to ask. Thanks, guys.